International Relations Society's first seminar. The format of the seminar is that our speaker will speak for under an hour, and then we will attempt to accommodate as many questions as possible, and then in the remaining hour. Please keep your questions short to the point, and we can accommodate everyone's inquiries. Could I also request that everyone's phone be put on silent just to prevent any possible disturbances? Well, today I have the pleasure of introducing Safar Yusuf. Mr. Yusuf is a first-year undergraduate student here at the Middle East Technical University, Northern Cyprus Campus. He just recently published an article highlighting the failures of the state of Pakistan in addressing terrorism and the fundamental flaws in its counter-terrorism policy. The article was published in the International Journal of Terrorism and Political Hotspots. Mr. Yusuf's interests are wide-ranging from terrorism to East Asia, as we will see today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Safar Yusuf.
I'd like to begin by stating one of the remarks of the renowned intellectual Noam Chomsky, dating back to an article in April of 1998, where he says that the concept of rogue states plays a preeminent role in today's policy planning and analysis. The same can be said very much today, 20 years later, and one needn't go further than to examine the list of countries subject to US aggression and the list of so-called rogue states, and the conclusion becomes quite clear. The doctrine is the same, however, there has been a shift in terminology since the Cold War period and the post-Cold War period. Well, during the Cold War period it was called the, quote, fight against communism. This was very evident in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Nicaragua in 1981, and the list goes on. But it was, in effect, a fight against regimes that we didn't like, so although, of course, democratically elected, we overthrow them and they don't serve our interests, so we get rid of them. In the post-Cold War era, the same doctrine became known as the doctrine of rogue states. Right after the first Gulf War in 1991, early 90s, Iraq had become the archetype and example of the doctrine of categorization. It was, again, in essence, nothing new that nation-states who pursue nationalist, perhaps independent policies were overthrown or were against our interests. During this categorization, the Clinton administration, who was responsible for the categorization, had identified a core group consisting of a couple of countries, Iraq, Libya, Iran, and North Korea. And I think the conclusion now is a bit clear as to what the policies were that were being followed. But this doctrine of rogue states was a concept of unilateral American exceptionalism and decision-making under international law. And of course, it must be said that while this doctrine or categorization of these said states didn't alter the legal or international status, categorization meant complete and unilateral US international decision-making regardless of international law. Of course, nothing new, but during the Cold War it was a bit harder to determine it since it was a fight against communism. Now it's a lot more apparent that such a doctrine is being applied. Well, like I said, Iraq was an example, the perfect example of this doctrine. And it's worth noting and worth examining the exceptionalism under international law that the United States followed through with in the case of Iraq. If you go back to the follow-up to the pre-Iraq war period, much of the media discourse ignored the international legal obligations of the US and UK. Here it's again worth mentioning that there is an existing framework or international law that is for such instances such as the Iraq War, where if, and I emphasize the if, any rational reason could justify the grievances that the US felt. And the relevant framework can be seen in the United Nations Charter, the foundation of international law, where if you examine Article 39, it says that the Charter states that the Security Council shall determine the existence to any threat to the peace, breach of peace, or an act of aggression, and shall make recommendations according to the United Nations Charter. And again, it highlights that there's a preference of the measures not involving US armed forces. Of course, at complete odds with the Iraq War. If you go into international law deeper, you find that the United Nations Security Council must take action when and if needed. But there are certain exceptions, such as Article 51, which permits collective or individual self-defense against armed attack. And again, the emphasis also on armed attack. But it goes on to say that until the United Nations Security Council takes appropriate measures to ensure that international stability and security is in place. So except for this exception of Article 51, all member states of the United Nations shall, according to the Charter, refrain from the use or threat of international force against any other member state. So therefore it must follow that no unilateral determination of actions in such matters is in accordance with international law, or international norms for that sake. And this was very much exemplified in a statement of Madeleine Albright, the then US ambassador to the UN, who noted that Iraq is an area of vital interest to the US national interest, and therefore we will act unilaterally, of course, without external constraints. You just forget international law because it's an area of vital interest. So, of course, these rogue states don't abide by such norms and such matters. And furthermore, the Security Council, when it becomes uncooperative and declines your idea of aggression or force, it becomes unimportant in a world which is dominated by rogue states which reject the rule of law. And this isn't limited to Iraq. And I don't have to go into other instances, it would take too much time, but to briefly mention, it's very much a commonplace practice and attitude of the unimportance of international law for the United States. If you go back to 1986, there was a World Court or International Court of Justice ruling which was against the United States for its, quote, unlawful use of force against Nicaragua. Of course, since it's against us and it exposes us, the World Court and the judgment itself was denounced throughout the US, throughout the media, and throughout most intellectual circles. And however, right after the judgment, the US Congress had increased what it called humanitarian aid, which, according to the judgment itself, was actually military aid. Then the United Nations Security Council had introduced a resolution to condemn what had been done and to call by states to abide by international law, to which the United States vetoed. But again, this is barely reported in the mainstream media. And it was, again, very much exemplified the attitude towards the World Court in the immediate aftermath of the decision by Secretary of State George Shultz in April of 1986, where he said that negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not across the bargaining table. And he condemned what he called outside mediations, such as the World Court and the United Nations. The non-use of aggression, specifically militarily, is particularly undermined in Washington, where the justifications for the use of aggression are quite blatantly ridiculous. If you take the bombing of Libya in 1986, it was called self-defense against future attack. The invasion of Panama in 1989 was called defense from the use of territory from being used as a base for drug smuggling into the United States. But again, these justifications are not questioned and they're very simply accepted. But this is only scratching the surface of American exceptionalism and the threat it poses as a rogue state. But to go back to the concept and doctrine of rogue states, it very much is apparent when one examines the doctrine that it's very much selective categorization. And there are two very specific countries in which the categorization applies, but it wasn't applied in reality. The state of Syria, which fit the category very well back in 1994, early 90s, due to the use and manufacturing of chemical weapons, the use of state-sponsored terrorism. It wasn't included in the categorization because it was important to Israeli peace talks. So again, when it's in our national interests, then we ignore simply the states that deserve to be highlighted as so-called rogue states, but we ignore it. Another state was Indonesia, which at the time had killed tens of thousands of people and had invaded the territory of East Timor, but again it wasn't included because the then President Clinton had called him General Suharto our kind of guy, and therefore it wasn't included because it was in our national interests. Around the year 2000, Madeleine Albright, the US ambassador to the UN, had dropped the term so-called rogue states in favor of states of concern. But immediately, as soon as George W. Bush in the pre-9/11 period had come into office, he brought the term back to differentiate himself from the Democrat Clinton. Well, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was this sort of redefinition of the threat of rogue states. It was no longer about containing the threat, but pursuing actively the policy of regime change. It was that the nature of the regime itself wasn't a threat. And of course, diplomacy wasn't an option because the regime in nature wouldn't allow that. But there was one case and one precedent which was made in Libya in 2003, where it ensured regime change through the regime as opposed to changing regime, where it gave up voluntarily its so-called weapons of mass destruction. But much of the later Bush administration had sent mixed signals about the policies they were trying to pursue, whether it be change through regime or change in regime. But it was mostly change in regime as opposed to the change through regime. But now that the context, quite important context, is set for these so-called rogue states, whether it be the United States or otherwise, it leads us to the last so-called rogue states to be dealt with aside from the US. And it's quite important to analyze much of the mainstream media discourse on what is deemed as the quote North Korean paradox, which is incidentally a title of an article in the New York Times by Max Fisher, which is again worth reading to find out the sort of template of media discourse on North Korea, which particularly emphasizes the doctrine of rogue states, albeit towards only North Korea, not the United States. But there are certain themes that run through the mainstream media reporting on the situation regarding North Korea, which again employs this idea of rogue states above rational reporting and analysis. And the first theme, which is highlighted and important to analyze, is under the title of Why Peace is Riskier Than the Threat of War. And it very much is this common media policy of depicting the Kim regime or North Korea as this crazed militaristic state on the verge of near war, which again is highlighted to be an employed tactic by the Kim regime as an explanation of rationing and shortages of food and ultra-nationalism. And that furthermore, if there were concessions by the United States, for example, or threats, it wouldn't override this crazed militaristic dictator, and therefore we completely forget about it. But the facts are very different, and it's very much highlighted by a claim of Bruce Cummings, a Korean history professor at Columbia, who claims that there is very much a missing recognition amongst the media and amongst the US administration about the true North Korean political system. And he also notes that the North Korean system is very much not maintained by this idea of draconian totalitarianism, as is maintained by most mainstream media analysts and most so-called experts, as it very much ignores the history of the collapse of almost all previously communist states. And very simply to put it, the main reason as to why North Korea has survived, despite the overwhelming predictions of its eventual demise, a point I'll come to later, is because of the extreme divergence from Marxism or communism. The true Korean regime and true Korean political system had revived this ancient political tradition of Neo-Confucian ideology, which was incidentally the ruling doctrine of Korea's old Choson dynasty dating back to the late 1300s and early 1900s. But this traditional school of thought had particularly emphasized that the, quote, state had its model in the family, with the leader serving as the father of the people and his main function being to educate and transform the subjects by rule and moral example, which any introductory course to Marxism will tell you is very much not Marxism. But again, the Neo-Confucian school of thought had also emphasized that there would be extremely clear and defined hierarchies, centralized bureaucracy, obedience to the state, and social stability. much of which we will find that now is working in favor of the Kim regime and has maintained it. But again, this is virtually the reason as to why North Korea has remained so politically stable while everything else has collapsed, whether it be external threats such as the Soviet Union or Western communism, or internal threats such as the virtual collapse of the industrial or agricultural sectors of the economy, famine, or the death of Kim Il-sung, the founding father. But correctly, Professor Cummings notes that there is an unusual but predictable combination of monarchy, anti-imperial nationalism, and Korean political culture, which maintains much of the Kim regime. But the second theme, which is quite important in my opinion, is titled A Desire for Extreme Risk, which is essentially summarized in the article as how could any concession remove the North Korean weakness that drives its behavior, i.e. The weakness being that it accepts the risks, or hyper-risk as deemed by most analysts, which is essentially another word for standing up to the United States. And here it's important to point out these said risks that North Korea faces in order to desire the hyper-risk. Now, if you look at recent events such as the US dropping of the largest non-nuclear weapon in Afghanistan, the dispatching of an aircraft carrier to the Korean Peninsula, launching 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria, which is a sovereign state, I must remind, and much less reported in the media, because of course when the US does it, it's not considered a risk. It test dropped a newly upgraded version of a nuclear bomb. There is furthermore a constant risk of aggression, which is maintained in the Korean Peninsula, which is pretty much exemplified in the fact that both in Japan and South Korea, there is a total of 37 military bases, with in Japan alone housing 50,000 troops, and in South Korea housing 28,500 troops. But to keep aside recent events and the use of constant aggression, there was a U.S. nuclear forces modernization program under the Obama administration, which had, quote, boosted the overall killing power of existing U.S. ballistic missile forces by a factor of roughly 3. And it creates exactly what one would expect to see if a nuclear-armed state was planning to have the capacity to fight and win a nuclear war by disarming enemies with a surprise first strike. And this, I'm quoting from a nuclear scientist in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. But again, when the United States does it and develops these weapons, it's, we don't have to worry about that. But if you go back to the Korean War, there is a vivid memory of the Koreans, of the Korean War, and the where the U.S. bombed, and as what Secretary of State Dean Rusk had noted, everything that moved, every brick on top of one another. And there was certain events and certain highlighted events, such as the bombing of 5 irrigation dams, which flooded farmlands and crops. And in the words of a Korean War veteran, the last time an act of this kind had been carried out, which was by the Nazis in Holland in 1944, it was deemed a war crime at Nuremberg. And it, furthermore, he also notes that the flooding had, quote, helped to destroy North Korea's ability to feed itself. So, but we ignore that because it's done by the US. There was also 650,000 tons of bombs during the war, the 1950 to 1953, compared to the 500,000 tons in the Pacific Theater during World War II. So 150,000 tons more than the entire period of World War II in the Pacific Theater. Also, there was 30,000 tons of napalm, which is essentially a chemical weapon, which is used during the Korean War. But the pilots themselves were ordered to, quote, hit anything that moved, and as a result of this, 18 out of 22 cities were obliterated completely. 75% of Pyongyang was completely destroyed, and 100% of Sinjar was also destroyed. But it's important to examine the mentality of such the Air Force at the time, and it's very much evident in the Air Force General Curtis LeMay, who notes that we burned every town in North Korea and South Korea too. He also goes on to say that we killed about 20% of the population. LeMay had also proposed at the beginning of the war that to completely annihilate everything we ought to use nuclear weapons and nuclear bombs, but this was rejected because it was too many people would die, so we might as well do it over 3 years. But again, this very much indicates the mentality of those who were engaged in this war. Well, if you look at soon after the Korean War had ended in 1958, the US had introduced hundreds of nuclear weapons to the peninsula. Approximately the average number is 530 warheads. And of course, although this was prohibited under the armistice agreements, which prohibited the introduction of new weaponry into the Korean peninsula, the US could do it if it wished to do so, and nobody would say anything. And the idea behind it was as Secretary of State John Foster Dulles notes, that North and South Korea will think twice about starting a war that would rain nuclear destruction, and the idea of deterrence theory against the North Koreans. But by the mid-1960s, nuclear weapons, again, like I said, existed on the Korean peninsula on the account of the United States. And the idea was to use nuclear weapons in the, quote, very early stages of a Korean conflict. And this is a quote from an off-the-record presentation in the 1990s from a commander of the US forces in Korea. Well, they were eventually removed towards the early 1990s, according to the official record. But very much is remembered or even reported about the Korean War, and it is deemed the, quote, forgotten war. Of course, when a state responds, if you can call it a response to US aggression historically and currently, then you become a state which has quote, a desire for extreme risk. The third theme which is ought to be explored is titled The Hair Trigger to Nuclear Escalation. And to understand why US and North Korean situation has become what it has become, it's important to review the history of the relationship between these two states to understand why it has become a, quote, hair trigger to nuclear escalation. Of course, the implication being that North Korea would solely be responsible for such an escalation here, and it's important to note that North Korea had once halted its nuclear program in the past. If you go back to August of 1994, in the first Clinton administration, there was what was called an agreed statement established between North Korea and the United States. And it essentially created a three-stage process for the elimination of North Korea's nuclear program, which in exchange the US would provide and move towards normalizing economic and diplomatic relations. But by mid-October, out of this agreed statement came an agreed framework, which was formed approximately after 4 months of intense negotiations. And the framework undoubtedly settled more US concerns, as 7 of the 9 provisions were aimed at North Korea. And the basic summary of the agreement was that the nuclear program would come to a halt so that the ongoing construction of the 2 nuclear facilities that were planned would be paused and halted, and that the existing facility would also be disbanded and wouldn't possibly be used for nuclear weapons or the building of nuclear weapons. And additionally, the International Atomic Agency would have the ability to conduct special inspections to ensure compliance with the agreement. And in exchange for this, North Korea would receive light water reactors and the movement towards the normalization of relations. In late November, the Atomic Agency confirmed that the construction of the nuclear facilities in North Korea was halted, and they were not operational, of course in line with the agreed framework. And there is scholarly literature which opines that the US was very much responsible for the breaking down of the agreement, and it provides very justified, logical reasons as to why North Korea continued its nuclear program after blatant US disregard for the agreement and for the framework. I haven't the time now to explain every single piece of legal and other evidence, but if anyone is interested, it's available on the public record. Again, it's important to note that later, per the agreement and the framework, US inspectors found absolutely no evidence of nuclear activity or violation of the agreed framework with the United States. But prior to the inauguration of George W. Bush, there was absolutely no evidence to support the claim that North Korea had firstly broken the important provisions of the agreement, or secondly had restarted its nuclear program. And right after the Bush inauguration, it was very simple to say that Bush-era policies were completely disastrous towards North Korea. The administration had basically sent extremely mixed signals to North Korea, not only with the famous axis of evil remarks, but also with what the Kim regime saw as an indication of a possible preemptive nuclear strike, and there were rational reasons for this. To begin with, the invasion of Afghanistan and the expanding quote, war on terror, and the state sponsors of terror made the Kim regime very worried that it could be next on the list. Of course, the invasion and occupation of Iraq made matters a lot worse. There was a Bush administration report which was released, which, quote, emphasized preemptively attacking countries developing weapons of mass destruction, of course explicitly mentioning North Korea in the report. And lastly, the third rational reason was that a leaked version of the Bush administration in January 2002 as classified nuclear posture review listed North Korea as a country against which the United States should, quote, be prepared to use nuclear weapons. Of course, undoubtedly the North Koreans turned to restarting its nuclear program in order to maintain a deterrent against the state which, of course, when faced with aggression of the Bush administration, could possibly launch an all-out war. Of course, while no progress by the US had been made regarding the agreed framework, North Korea had been legally obliging to their specific provisions which ensured the discontinuation of their nuclear program. Well, if you jump forward to September of 2005, there was a joint statement which was published during six-party talks between the United States, North Korea, China, and a couple of other countries, which indicated the intention that of what could be deemed a reasonable agreement. But again, interestingly enough, Kenneth Quinones, a State Department official, but now a civilian back channel for the two countries, had noted that this was after two previous attempts, or failed attempts, at diplomacy. The first time was unsuccessful when Bush called the Kim regime tyrannical, and so the meetings were called off. And the second was when the US troops had pulled out from North Korea when they were assisting with the Korean War remains, and so it was again called off. Well, in line with the 2005 supposed agreement or intention of agreement, the North Korean side would terminate its nuclear weapons program and abide by the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, rejoin the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Atomic Agency safeguards, which again on the US side, they would receive relief from sanctions, the North Koreans. There would be an unfreezing of financial assets. The Koreans would also be able to use low-enriched uranium for medical and civilian purposes, and a non-aggression pact would be signed with the United States. But of course, unsurprisingly, shortly after, the US administration under Bush virtually completely reversed its intended promises, along with the freezing of assets and disruption of financial transactions with other countries through banks in Macau. And of course, it derailed the entire process and any hopes for agreement, and the North Koreans shortly after tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. So far as any historian will view it, or any expert on the region will view it, the North Koreans have been playing what's been called a tit-for-tat policy, that they reciprocate whenever Washington cooperates and retaliates whenever it doesn't. And if you come to the Obama administration, much hasn't changed. In early 2015, both Chinese and North Korean officials had proposed an offer that the North Koreans would offer to halt its testing of nuclear weapons in return for the cancellation of the annual joint military exercises with South Korea. Of course, again, the Obama administration completely rejected the offer, and again, this isn't received much media attention. In mid-March of this year, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson ruled out any return to negotiations, with North Korea proclaiming that the era of, quote, strategic patience has ended. 2 months prior to his rejection of negotiations, North Korean foreign ministry officials had claimed that the negotiations were possible. However, of course, certain conditions would need to apply, such as the cancellation of US-South Korean military deals, which it claimed were, quote, at its doorstep. And additionally, South Korean news services also pointed out that the, quote, North Korea was seeking negotiations. Of course, while the North Korean ambassador to the United Nations had claimed that if Trump really gave up the hostile policy towards North Korea, then negotiations back in the 1990s were possible. And another extremely important aspect or theme which the media has established is very much highlighted in the idea that any agreement that North Korea would be likely to consider minimally acceptable would come at a huge cost to the US and its allies. And this leads me to my fourth theme, which is the high costs of a deal. Of course, in the article, The North Korean Paradox, the New York Times article, Max Fisher outlines certain agreements, certain provisions in the agreements for a deal that would, quote, come at a huge cost to the US and furthermore weaken American influence in Asia. Of course, risks that the US simply cannot afford, even when risking a nuclear catastrophe. And the provisions are that, firstly, an acknowledgement of the country's right to retain its existing program, which again is of course unacceptable. Due to this would mean that the North Korea would have the legitimate right to self-defense in the face of an extremely aggressive adversary who's already proved why North Korea must retain a deterrent. And all of this while the US tests its ballistic missiles and under its new modernization program, which again increases overall power by a factor of 3. Of course, it's uncontroversial when the United States does it and is barely mentioned in the media and never highlighted as a supposed risk or threat. And secondly, a declaration that the, quote, US considers the North Korean government legitimate and would not seek to topple it. Again, this is an unacceptable agreement more than any other point, as it would mean that the US would have to abide by international law and refrain from influencing or engaging in internal affairs of a sovereign state, which of course the US must always retain the right to overthrow a government when it deems it so, as history shows, and that furthermore accepting the Kim regime as legitimate would by default remove the idea that the regime is this irrational warmongering regime, but it's very much shown to be the complete opposite if you look at statements by former Secretary of Defense William Perry, who had negotiated the agreed framework in 1994, who notes that, quote, during my discussions and negotiations with members of the North Korean government, I have found that they are not irrational. Their goals are, in order of priority, are to preserve the Kim dynasty, gain international respect, and improve their own economy. Again, the third theme, or important, or too high of a cost of a deal, is the lifting of sanctions. Of course, an extremely oppressive policy which has throughout history never worked, if rarely worked as a means of getting a negotiated settlement on the table. And you don't have to take my word for it, take a leading arms control expert who notes that it was the negotiations and not the sanctions that ultimately stopped Iran's nuclear program. And finally, the withdrawal of or the reduction of American military commitment to South Korea, which of course an agreement like this would be unimaginable within the US administration, as it would mean clearly a waning influence only in East Asia alone, but therefore it can't be permitted at all. As for solutions for this so-called crisis or, quote, threat to world peace, there are simple policies which would very much have historically worked and would likely work in the future, which are to engage in diplomacy and not aggressive military policies, namely don't pursue what I've been describing this entire time. And it's almost laughable that one solution on how to resolve the issue is to abide by agreements that have been previously promised. And there are certain general provisions which lead us in the right direction, namely do the opposite of what I've been describing. Furthermore, there is other possibilities, such as to engage in diplomatic solutions, concluding the long overdue peace treaty between the South and the North, to refrain from committing provocative military maneuvers, removing military bases and troops from the region, and to promote policies such as the Sunshine Policy. But most importantly, stay out of the region. Thank you.
So we will begin with the questions.
Safar, I know that the history of the US intervening militarily and stuff mostly is wrong, like even in Iraq where I come from. But don't you think like Korea already did or still doing like unforgivable crimes, like if you put a military intervention but with a solid afterwards strategy, wouldn't that be better for the region and the Korean people itself?
Yeah, I mean, with what's good for the people, I think is very different from the idea of abiding by international law. Again, you know, if there, like I said, there are certain framework, or there is certain framework within international law to address grievances. but it's only in the case where if the Security Council takes, multilateral decision making. But again, you can't take unilateral decision making. When you do that, it's against international law. And again, whatever you think of the regime, it may be the worst regime in history. I don't agree. I don't disagree with that. But there is, certain international legal obligations that the United States has to uphold. Of course, again, if they go to the United Nations Security Council and there is a multilateral agreement, then of course there is certain policies which they may pursue, which might be, like you said, in favor of the Korean people.
Safar, thank you also. Can you explain sunshine policy?
So one of the policies I said which would work is the sunshine policy. It was basically instituted in 1998 by the then South Korean President Kim Dae-jung, who had taken a much reversed policy of the South Korean foreign policy towards North Korea, which was we should try to negotiate a settlement in which both North and South Korea would possibly reunify. Again, it was, as the record shows, it was completely and aggressively dismissed by the U.S. administration under Bush due to the possible political or economic bloc consisting of Japan, South Korea, and North Korea becoming an independent, perhaps nationalist regime, which of course the U.S. wouldn't want. So.
Okay, thank you all for the very interesting questions and insightful answers from Mr. Yusuf. I'd like to thank you all for attending today's session. We hope to host more undergraduate students and professors who will be lecturing on important discussions. Thank you again.